Ron DeSantis stepped up to the podium at the National Conservatism Conference, lightly straightening his dark navy suit. The 46-year-old Florida governor, who had recently ended a failed run for president, was preparing to give what his team promoted as a major speech, one meant to reshape ideas about American governance and reassert his relevance after the campaign. His plan was to highlight the aggressive governing style that helped him win re-election in Florida, even though that same approach fell apart during the Republican primary. DeSantis, a Yale and Harvard law graduate known for using state authority to punish companies that disagreed with him, limit what teachers could discuss, block students from reading certain books, and push legislation targeting LGBTQ Floridians policies his own legal advisors admitted likely violated the Constitution, seemed convinced that this conservative gathering was the ideal stage to praise his confrontational style and present himself as the leader the Republican Party should follow. But despite his embarrassing presidential loss, the next 29 minutes would expose deeper issues, his authoritarian tendencies, and his weak grasp of constitutional limits when he was confronted by someone seated prominently in the first row. She had come prepared specifically to challenge his claims about freedom and constitutional government. What followed revealed that he had made a serious mistake by agreeing to take audience questions, especially when one attendee understood his actual record well enough to show that nearly every statement he made about protecting liberty clashed directly with his own pattern of attacking rights he personally objected to. Jasmine Crockett entered the conference as an invited provocateur, someone organizers assumed would give DeSantis a chance to show he could handle tough questions. Instead, when she stood up and pressed him on the constitutional grounding for his actions against Disney's speech, his limits on academic freedom, his book bans, and his policies targeting transgender Floridians, she cited court rulings that struck those policies down, rulings so detailed and precise that he appeared rattled, unable to offer any clear legal justification, beyond asserting that his political authority allowed him to enforce his views despite constitutional barriers. Before we walk through how Congresswoman Crockett used federal court decisions, including several written by judges appointed by Donald Trump, to demonstrate that DeSantis' so-called freedom agenda was actually an authoritarian attack on constitutional protections recognized by conservative jurists themselves, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. You'll stay updated whenever moments like this occur, when accurate legal facts dismantle carefully crafted political stories. The National Conservatism Conference has become the central meeting place for conservatives who reject traditional small government principles and instead advocate for using the power of the state aggressively to push cultural and political goals. Leaders of this movement argue that conservatives lost cultural influence because they refused to fully use governmental authority when they had it, and that future conservative leadership requires abandoning restraint in favor of rewarding supporters and punishing opponents. DeSantis had become the movement's ideal example of a governor by openly using the full power of Florida's government as a weapon against corporations, schools, and private citizens whose beliefs clashed with his conservative Christian nationalist agenda. Conference organizers invited Crockett to join a panel discussion after DeSantis' keynote speech, believing that bringing in a progressive voice would show their confidence in their arguments and allow speakers to contrast their conservative vision with what they saw as weak and ineffective progressive ideas. What they did not seem to expect was that Crockett would avoid broad ideological debates and instead carefully walk through the real legal record showing how federal courts had repeatedly struck down DeSantis' policies for violating the Constitution. DeSantis delivered his keynote with his usual aggressive certainty, presenting himself as the governor who taught conservatives how to fight and win cultural conflicts instead of complaining about them. He claimed his battle with Disney was simply about defending parental rights and state authority against what he called woke corporate influence. He described his education policies as efforts to shield students from ideological indoctrination and empower parents to decide what their children learn. He framed his bans on gender-affirming care and his bathroom regulations as measures to protect women and children from what he labeled harmful transgender ideas. His message energized the audience of conservative activists, who applauded his combative tone and embraced his framing of every dispute as a fight between freedom and tyranny. With DeSantis insisting he was defending liberty against progressive authoritarianism, he positioned himself as the leader of a freedom-focused movement that rejected what he portrayed as the Democratic Party's culture of grievance and instead promoted traditional values and national pride. His delivery was practiced, and his speech aimed to restore his reputation after his failed presidential run by showing that his style still resonated strongly with friendly audiences. Even if it fell flat with primary voters, when he invited questions, Crockett quickly raised her hand. DeSantis acknowledged her with a slight smirk, seemingly confident that engaging with a progressive critic would finally allow him to show the debating skill his presidential campaign never displayed. She stood, thanked him for recognizing her, and explained that she wanted to focus on the constitutional basis of several policies he highlighted in his remarks. She began with his claim that challenging Disney was an act of defending state sovereignty and parental rights. She pointed out that after Disney criticized his Parental Rights in Education Act, he signed legislation dismantling Disney's Reedy Creek Special District in action, even conservative legal experts had described as unconstitutional retaliation for Disney's protected speech. She asked him directly what constitutional authority allowed a state government to punish a corporation for using its First Amendment right to speak out against public policy. DeSantis replied that Disney had crossed a line by engaging in what he described as improper political advocacy against legislation meant to protect children, and he insisted that Florida was justified in re-examining special privileges given to a company that opposed the state's values. His reply sidestepped the constitutional issue entirely and instead shifted to policy arguments, making clear that he either did not understand or did not care about the First Amendment's limits on government retaliation for protected speech. Crockett pointed out that he had not answered the constitutional question and pressed him again, asking whether he accepted that the First Amendment forbids the government from punishing speakers based on their viewpoint. DeSantis brushed off the concern, saying he understood constitutional law very well because he had graduated from Harvard Law School and served in Congress, and he insisted that Florida's actions were fully lawful. At that moment, the Congresswoman delivered the first major blow that showed DeSantis he was stepping into territory he had not prepared for. She reminded the audience that Disney had filed a federal lawsuit alleging First Amendment retaliation, and that the case was moving forward because DeSantis' own lawyers struggled to identify any legitimate government reason for removing the special district other than punishing the company for its criticism. She added that even though the final ruling had not yet come down, his inability to provide a constitutional justification beyond claiming legislative authority showed that the move was exactly the type of viewpoint-based retaliation the First Amendment prohibits. She then shifted to his education policies, which he had presented as efforts to protect children and give parents greater control. Crockett noted that the Stop Woke Act, which restricted corporate and educational speech, had been struck down by a federal judge appointed by Donald Trump, who ruled that the law was a clear example of viewpoint discrimination in violation of the First Amendment. She asked how a policy he claimed defended freedom could be judged unconstitutional for violating free speech protections. DeSantis tried to argue that the ruling was incorrect and that courts sometimes make mistakes that would eventually be fixed on appeal. But Crockett immediately pointed out that the 11th Circuit had upheld major parts of the lower court's decision and that multiple Trump-appointed judges had now found his key education law unconstitutional. She observed that when judges selected by a president he supported applied long-standing First Amendment standards and repeatedly found his policies unlawful, the issue appeared to lie with his policies, not the courts. She continued by addressing his Individual Freedom Act limits on academic instruction, noting that a federal court had issued a preliminary injunction preventing enforcement because the law likely violated the First Amendment by restricting what professors could teach, simply because the state disagreed with certain viewpoints. She asked how limiting what university faculty could say in their own classrooms could possibly advance freedom when federal courts had concluded that such limits violated academic freedom protected by the First Amendment. The governor's confidence began to noticeably weaken as Crockett continued laying out one federal court ruling after another that had declared his policies unconstitutional. He tried to argue that shielding students from divisive ideas was an important state interest, but she immediately pointed out that long-standing Supreme Court precedent makes clear that a state's desire to suppress ideas it dislikes cannot justify content-based limits on speech. And she noted that his reasoning fits squarely within the exact type of argument First Amendment doctrine repeatedly rejects. Crockett then shifted to his restrictions on gender-affirming health care and his bathroom bills policies he framed as protecting women and children. She explained that federal courts in several other states had already blocked similar laws, finding they likely violated the equal protection and due process rights of transgender individuals. She emphasized that his claim of defending freedom ignored the fact that these measures limited the freedom of transgender Floridians to obtain medically recommended treatment and to use facilities aligned with their gender identity. She asked whether his so-called freedom agenda extended to transgender residents or whether he reserved freedom only for people who shared his values and supported his policies. DeSantis tried to respond by saying that safeguarding women's sports and preventing children from undergoing harmful experimental procedures were legitimate state goals. But Crockett pointed out that he still had not answered whether freedom applied equally to all Floridians or only to those he personally approved of. She then delivered her most sweeping rebuttal, the one that left DeSantis frozen, unable to produce a coherent answer. She laid out the full legal record surrounding his policies, the Stop Woke Act struck down by a Trump-appointed federal judge, with major portions upheld on appeal as unconstitutional viewpoint discrimination. His limits on instruction about sexual orientation and gender identity still being challenged, with preliminary findings that they likely violate the First Amendment. His restrictions on academic freedom blocked by a federal court as an unconstitutional content-based speech restriction. His retaliation against Disney tied up in active litigation alleging First Amendment violations backed by extensive evidence of retaliatory intent. His bans on gender-affirming medical care, mirrored by laws in other states that federal courts have blocked on constitutional grounds. And his book removal policies resulting in thousands of titles being taken off shelves, creating a chilling effect that First Amendment jurisprudence recognizes as a constitutional violation even without a formal ban. She concluded by noting that this entire record revealed a clear and consistent pattern. DeSantis policies were repeatedly struck down or challenged for violating constitutional protections, and federal judges, including many appointed by Donald Trump, had found that his so-called freedom agenda actually restricted rights that the Constitution is meant to safeguard. She pointed out that a governor whose signature policies had repeatedly been struck down by federal courts was not actually defending freedom, but rather using the power of government to impose his personal beliefs, regardless of constitutional limits. Crockett then asked DeSantis directly, if your freedom agenda is truly constitutional and reflects American values as you claim, why have federal courts, including judges appointed by Republican presidents, repeatedly ruled that your policies violate protections for free speech, academic freedom, and equal protection? She pressed him further, asking whether he would admit that courts had found his actions unconstitutional, or whether he would continue insisting that any judge who disagreed with him was simply wrong. The question lingered as DeSantis froze at the podium, his face revealing genuine shock that someone had come prepared with a thorough record of his legal failures. The audience that had previously cheered his speech fell silent, realizing that Crockett had not engaged in political argument but had instead presented a detailed legal record showing that his policies failed constitutional review. The governor attempted a response, but it was defensive and evasive. He suggested that legal challenges were to be expected when implementing ambitious policies, argued that court rulings did not determine constitutional validity, and stated that Florida would continue defending its actions. His answer completely avoided acknowledging that courts had already found his policies unconstitutional and offered no genuine constitutional argument, instead relying on the assertion that he believed he was right. Crockett noted that his response confirmed he could not legally justify his policies and was merely asserting power to enforce them despite repeated court findings. She explained that this was authoritarian governance, not a freedom agenda, and argued that true conservatism respects constitutional limits rather than treating them as obstacles to be ignored. The exchange quickly went viral, as both conservative and progressive audiences recognized that Crockett had systematically dismantled DeSantis' narrative of protecting liberty using federal court records. Legal experts verified her points, confirming that his policies had faced repeated constitutional challenges with numerous adverse rulings. The image of DeSantis frozen, listening as she recited decision after decision, became an iconic moment symbolizing a politician whose rhetoric collapsed when confronted with documented evidence of failure. This episode became a defining moment, demonstrating that DeSantis' authoritarian approach could not withstand scrutiny from someone who had thoroughly researched his legal record. If you found this breakdown informative, be sure to like and subscribe.